The sound of splintering wood woke Dakota Ashford from a dream he could not remember, and in the 3 seconds it took him to open his eyes and swing his legs off the narrow bed. His entire life crashed down around him with a roar that shook the ground beneath the ranch house. He ran barefoot across the cold floor, throwing open the door to see his barn folding in on itself like a house of cards. The roof beams snapping with cracks that echoed across the Texas prairie like gunshots. The structure that had taken him 2 years to build, that held everything he owned worth keeping, collapsed into a mountain of broken timber and twisted metal in the pre-dawn darkness of that March morning in 1882. Dakota stood frozen in his doorway, watching dust rise in great clouds that caught the first pale light creeping over the horizon, and felt something inside his chest collapse right along with it. He was 26 years old and had spent every dollar he had buying this land outside Fort Worth, Texas, 3 years ago. The barn had held his winter supplies, his tools, the seed he needed for spring planting, the tack for his 3 horses, and the modest collection of belongings he had brought west from Missouri after his parents died. Now it was all buried under what looked like 1,000 pounds of rubble, and Dakota could not move, could not think, could only stare at the destruction and feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. The sound of hoofbeats pulled him from his paralysis. He looked up to see a rider approaching fast from the direction of the neighboring property, and even through the dust and dim light, he recognized the horse. It was the gray mare that belonged to the Millers, the family that owned the ranch to the east. As the rider drew closer, Dakota realized it was not old Samuel Miller but his daughter, and she was riding like something was chasing her. Tessa Miller pulled her mare to a sliding stop 20 feet from where Dakota stood and swung down from the saddle before the animal had fully halted. She was dressed in men's clothes, trousers and a work shirt, her dark blonde hair tied back in a braid that hung down past her shoulders. Dakota had seen her around Fort Worth a handful of times over the past 3 years, had nodded to her at the general store and once at church, but they had never exchanged more than polite greetings. He knew she was 23, that her mother had died when she was young, and that she helped her father run their cattle operation with a competence that made some of the men in town uncomfortable. "I heard the crash from our place," she said, breathing hard as she looked past him at the wreckage. "Sweet mercy, Dakota, what happened?" He found his voice somewhere in the tightness of his throat. "I do not know. I was asleep. The whole thing just came down." Tessa walked past him toward the ruins, her boots crunching on debris that had been thrown clear of the main pile. She moved carefully, studying the wreckage with an intensity that seemed odd given that they barely knew each other. Dakota followed, still barefoot, feeling splinters bite into his soles but not caring much. "There," she said, pointing to the western corner of what had been the barn. "See how those posts are rotted through at the base? And there, same thing. This was not an accident, Dakota. This was time and water damage eating away at your foundation. Did you notice any sagging in the roof the past few weeks?" He tried to think back, but everything before the sound of the collapse seemed distant now, unimportant. "Maybe. I do not know. I have been so focused on getting ready for spring work I might have missed it." "It happens," Tessa said, and her voice was gentler now. "My father lost a shed the same way 2 winters back. The ground here holds water in pockets, and if you built on one without knowing it, it will rot out wood faster than you would believe." Dakota looked at the mountain of wreckage and felt exhaustion wash over him despite the early hour. "Everything I own is under there. Everything I need to plant this season to survive the next year. I am ruined." "No, you are not," Tessa said firmly. She turned to face him, and in the growing light he could see that her eyes were a pale green, the color of new leaves. You are not ruined, you are just in trouble, but trouble can be fixed if you are willing to work for it. I do not see how. Then it is fortunate I do. She walked back to her mare and began untying a coil of rope from her saddle. Get yourself some boots on and some gloves if you have them. We are going to start digging out what can be saved. My father will not need me until this afternoon, so we have got about 8 hours. Let us see what we can do with them. Dakota wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that this was his problem and he would handle it himself. But the words would not come because he knew they would be lies. He could not handle this alone, not in any time frame that would matter, and pride seemed like a luxury he could not afford standing there in the ruins of everything he had built. So, instead, he nodded and went to find his boots. By the time he returned, properly dressed and with his work gloves tucked into his belt, Tessa had already begun pulling boards away from the edge of the collapsed structure. She had stripped down to just her shirt despite the morning chill, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and she was attacking the wreckage with a methodical efficiency that spoke of someone who knew hard work intimately. "Start on that side," she called to him. "Look for anything that might be salvageable, tools especially. We will need them to make this go faster." They worked in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the scrape of wood on wood, the clatter of falling boards, and their own labored breathing. Dakota's hands were bleeding within 20 minutes despite the gloves, splinters driving through the worn leather, but he did not stop. Tessa did not stop either, though he saw her wince more than once when she grabbed a board wrong or when the weight of a beam proved more than she had anticipated. The sun climbed higher, warming the air but also making the work harder as sweat began to soak through their clothes. Dakota found his shovel first, then a pickaxe that had been thrown clear when the roof came down. With proper tools, they could move faster, and they did, clearing debris in a growing pile that looked almost as daunting as the wreckage itself. "There," Tessa said, pointing down into a gap they had opened. "I see a crate. Can you reach it?" Dakota lay flat on his stomach and stretched his arm down into the darkness, his fingers brushing smooth wood. He strained, feeling something in his shoulder protest, and managed to get a grip on the crate's edge. It was heavy, but he dragged it up and out, and when they pried the lid open, they found his collection of nails and screws, all sorted by size and type, miraculously undamaged. "That is a good sign," Tessa said, and she smiled at him for the first time since arriving. It changed her whole face, made her look younger and less serious, and Dakota felt something flutter in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. They kept digging. They found his seed stores next, the sacks torn but most of the contents intact. His tack was there too, though his best saddle was crushed beyond repair. They pulled out tools, supplies, a box of his mother's dishes that had survived the collapse without a single chip. Each discovery felt like a small victory, and with each one, Dakota felt some of the despair that had threatened to swallow him begin to lift. It was mid-morning when Tessa suddenly stopped working and held up her hand. "Listen, do you hear that?" Dakota went still and heard it too, a faint sound coming from deep within the wreckage. It sounded almost like whimpering. "What in God's name?" They both dropped to their knees and began moving boards frantically, following the sound. It grew louder, more insistent, and then suddenly Dakota saw movement in a gap between two beams. Yellow eyes stared back at him from the shadows, and a moment later a cat emerged, dusty and terrified but apparently unharmed. "Well, I will be," Dakota said softly. "I did not even know there was a cat living in my barn." The animal, a skinny orange tabby with one torn ear, wound itself around Tessa's legs and began purring so loudly they could both hear it over the sound of their own breathing. She reached down and picked it up, cradling it against her chest despite the dirt and cobwebs matting its fur. "You have got a barn cat now," she said, scratching behind its ears. "That is good luck, finding a life in all this destruction. It means things will get better." "You believe in signs like that?" "I believe we make our own luck most of the time," Tessa said, setting the cat down gently where it immediately began grooming itself. "But I also believe it does not hurt to take hope where you can find it. And something that survived what that little creature just survived deserves to be acknowledged." They went back to work, but something had shifted between them. Maybe it was the shared discovery of the cat. Or maybe it was simply the hours they had spent working side by side without complaint. But Dakota found himself talking to her as they dug, telling her about his life in Missouri, about how he had come to Texas looking for land he could afford, and a fresh start after losing his parents to fever. She talked, too, about growing up on the ranch with just her father after her mother died, about how she had learned to ride and rope and shoot because there was no one else to do the work. "The men in town think I am strange," she said, lifting a beam that should have been too heavy for her to manage alone. "They say I should be married by now, should be tending a house instead of cattle." "What do you think?" Dakota asked. "I think I will marry when I find someone who sees me as a partner instead of a possession. I think there is nothing wrong with a woman knowing how to work. My mother could outride most of the men in the county before she got sick, and my father loved her all the more for it." She paused, pushing hair back from her face and leaving a streak of dirt across her forehead. "But I also think it gets lonely sometimes, being different, even when you know you are right to be who you are." Dakota nodded slowly. He understood loneliness. He had been living with it for 3 years, ever since he had arrived in Texas, and realized that building a life from nothing meant building it alone, at least at first. He had told himself he would find someone eventually, would court one of the proper young women who came to Sunday services with their families, but he had never managed to work up the interest. They all seemed to want things he could not give them, or maybe he had just been too focused on survival to notice if any of them might have been different. But Tessa was different. That was clear. She was different in the way she worked, in the way she talked, in the way she had shown up at his property without being asked, and started helping without expecting anything in return. She was different in ways that made Dakota want to know her better, want to hear her laugh, want to see that smile again. "I do not think you are strange," he said quietly. "I think you are remarkable." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them that was not quite words but felt just as important. Then she ducked her head and went back to pulling boards away from the pile, and Dakota did the same, but the air between them felt different now, charged with a possibility that had not been there before. They worked until past noon, until Tessa finally straightened and pressed both hands to the small of her back, grimacing. "I have got to head home. My father will need help moving the herd to the north pasture, and I promised I would be there by early afternoon." "Tessa," Dakota said, and she turned back to him. "Thank you. I do not know how to repay you for this." "You do not need to repay me," she said, "but if you want to return the favor someday, I would not say no. I mean it. You saved me today. This would have taken me a week alone, and by then, half of what we found would have been ruined by weather or animals. You gave me a chance to rebuild." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something soft in her expression, something that made his heart beat faster. "Then rebuild, Dakota Ashford, and when you do, build it better than before. Build it to last." She rode away, and Dakota stood watching until she disappeared over the rise toward her father's land. Then he turned back to the wreckage, which looked less daunting now than it had at dawn, and he began to plan. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work that pushed Dakota to the edge of his endurance. He sorted through everything they had pulled from the wreckage, salvaging what could be saved and making lists of what needed to be replaced. His finances were grim. He had some money saved, but not enough to replace the barn and the lost supplies. He would have to make choices, prioritize, and even then, it was going to be close. On the 4th day, Tessa came back. She rode up just after dawn, and this time she had her father with her. Samuel Miller was a weathered man in his 50s with gray shot through his dark hair and the kind of sun-lined face that spoke of decades working outdoors. He looked at the ruins of Dakota's barn, then at Dakota himself, and nodded slowly. "My daughter tells me you could use some help," he said without preamble. "She also tells me you are too proud to ask for it, so I am not asking. I am telling you. We have got extra timber from when we rebuilt our bunkhouse last fall. You can have it. And I have got 3 ranch hands who owe me some time. They will be here tomorrow morning to help you raise a new barn." Dakota felt his throat go tight. "Mr. Miller, I cannot accept that. It is too much." "It is not enough, actually," Samuel said. "But it is what I have to offer, and you would be a fool to turn it down. This is Texas, son. We help our neighbors because someday we will be the ones needing help. That is how we survive out here." "He is right," Tessa said softly. "And besides, I already promised him you would help us with our spring roundup when the time comes. So you will work it off, if that makes you feel better about it." Dakota looked between them, these two people who barely knew him but were offering him a lifeline anyway, and he felt something break open inside his chest. "I do not know what to say." "Say yes," Samuel said. "And then say you will have coffee ready tomorrow morning when my boys show up, because they will be grumpy about the early start." So Dakota said yes, and Samuel Miller rode back to his ranch while Tessa stayed behind. She helped Dakota clear the last of the major debris, and as they worked, he asked her the question that had been nagging at him for days. "Why are you doing this? Why did you help me that first morning, and why are you still helping me now?" Tessa was quiet for a moment, stacking boards into neat piles. When she finally spoke, she did not look at him. "When my mother died, I was 12 years old. My father was destroyed by it, could barely function for months. The neighbors, they kept us going. They brought food, they helped with the cattle. They made sure we did not lose everything while my father was drowning in grief. I learned something then about what it means to be part of a community, about how you cannot make it alone out here no matter how strong you are." She paused, brushing sawdust from her hands. "But there is more to it than that, if I am being honest. I helped you that first morning because it was the right thing to do. I am helping you now because I want to." "Why?" She turned to face him then, and her pale green eyes were steady and serious. "Because I see something in you, Dakota Ashford. I see someone who is trying to build a life with his own 2 hands, who does not complain about the hardship, who treats me like an equal instead of a curiosity. And that is rare enough that I want to see where it might lead if you are interested in finding out." Dakota's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I am interested." "Good," she said, and there was that smile again, the one that changed her whole face. "Then let us finish cleaning up this mess, so you will have a proper space to build on. You are going to have a barn raising tomorrow, and those are important events. You want everything ready." They worked until sunset, until Dakota's property looked less like a disaster site and more like a construction zone. When Tessa finally rode home, Dakota stood in the middle of the cleared space and looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. And for the first time since the barn collapsed, he felt something like hope. The barn raising began at dawn the next day, and Dakota was stunned by how many people showed up. Samuel Miller brought his 3 ranch hands as promised, but he also brought 2 of his neighbors, and they brought their sons, and by the time the sun was fully up, there were 15 men and 4 women gathered on Dakota's property, all ready to work. Tessa arrived with the last group, riding alongside an older woman who introduced herself as Martha Thorne from the ranch 3 miles west. She took one look at Dakota's setup and immediately began organizing the women to handle food and water for the workers, directing them with the easy authority of someone who had done this many times before. "Do not look so shocked," Tessa said, coming to stand beside Dakota as he watched the organized chaos. "This is how things are done out here. Someone needs help, we all pitch in. Your turn will come to return the favor, but for today, just be grateful and put us to work." Samuel Miller took charge of the construction itself, and Dakota quickly realized the man knew more about barn building than he had ever learned. They started with the foundation, using stones to create a proper base that would not rot the way the old posts had. The work went faster than Dakota would have believed possible, with so many hands making quick work of tasks that would have taken him days alone. Tessa worked alongside the men, hauling timber and holding beams in place while they were secured. And if any of the workers thought it was strange for a woman to be doing such work, they kept their opinions to themselves. Dakota found himself watching her whenever he had a moment, admiring the way she moved, the way she laughed at something one of the ranch hands said, the way she brushed sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "She is a good one," Samuel said quietly, appearing at Dakota's elbow. "My daughter. She does not do anything halfway, never has. When she decides something is worth her time, she gives it everything she has." Dakota felt his face heat. "I was just noticing how hard everyone is working." "Sure you were." Samuel's tone was dry but not unkind. "Look, I am not a man who interferes in his daughter's choices. She is grown, and she has earned the right to make her own decisions. But I will say this much. She has not shown interest in any man in this county until now. So whatever is starting between you two, I suggest you take it seriously. Because she already is." Before Dakota could respond, Samuel walked away, leaving him standing there with his thoughts spinning. Did Tessa really see something between them, something real and not just born out of the crisis they had navigated together? And more importantly, did he? The answer came to him easily, almost before the question had fully formed. Yes. Yes, he did see something, feel something, want something with Tessa Miller that he had never wanted with anyone else. She made him feel capable, made him feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with pity or obligation. She looked at him and saw a partner, someone worth her time and effort, and that feeling was more intoxicating than anything he had ever experienced. They broke for lunch, and the women had prepared enough food to feed an army. There were biscuits and beans, cold chicken and fresh bread, pies that must have been baked the night before in anticipation of this day. Dakota moved through the crowd accepting thanks and good-natured ribbing from the workers, but his eyes kept finding Tessa, and every time they did, she was already looking back at him. Finally, as the lunch crowd began to disperse and people went back to work, Dakota made his way to where she was helping clean up the food. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course." They walked a short distance from the construction site, far enough that their conversation would not be overheard. Dakota had not planned what he was going to say, but the words came anyway, tumbling out in a rush that probably would have been embarrassing if he had stopped to think about it. "Your father says you have shown interest in me. Is that true?" Tessa raised an eyebrow, and there was amusement in her expression along with something that might have been nervousness. "He said that, did he? Well, I suppose there is no point in denying it. Yes, Dakota, I am interested." I have been since that first morning when I saw you standing there looking at the ruins of your barn like the world had ended, but refusing to give up anyway. That kind of resilience, it matters. Character matters. And I think you have got a good character underneath all that shock and grief. I am interested too, Dakota said. More than interested. Tessa, I know we barely know each other, but these past few days, working with you, talking with you, I have felt more alive than I have in years. And I would like to know where that might lead if you are willing to find out. I am willing, she said simply. But I need you to understand something first. I am not going to change who I am for any man. I am not going to suddenly become domestic and quiet and proper just because we are courting. I am going to keep working the ranch with my father, keep wearing trousers when it makes sense, keep being exactly who I have always been. If that is going to be a problem for you, tell me now before either of us gets hurt. Dakota reached out and took her hand, feeling the calluses on her palm, the strength in her fingers. I do not want you to change. I want exactly who you are, Tessa Miller. Exactly this. She smiled then, bright and real, and squeezed his hand. Then I guess we are courting, Dakota Ashford. Let us see where it takes us. They went back to work, but everything felt different now, charged with a new energy that made even the hardest tasks seem lighter. The barn took shape throughout the afternoon, the frame rising against the Texas sky, solid and strong. By sunset, the basic structure was complete, lacking only a proper door and some finishing work that Dakota could handle himself over the next few days. As the workers packed up their tools and prepared to head home, Samuel pulled Dakota aside. You did good work today. The barn is sound, better than what you had before, and you have got good neighbors now, people who know they can count on you when their turn comes. That is worth more than gold out here. I know, Dakota said. And I am grateful, Mr. Miller, to you especially. You did not have to do any of this. Call me Samuel, and I did have to because my daughter would never forgive me if I did not. He clapped Dakota on the shoulder. She is serious about you, I can see it, so I am trusting you not to break her heart. Are we clear? Yes, sir. I will do my best to be worthy of her. That is all any of us can do, Samuel said. Then he walked away to gather his workers, leaving Dakota standing in front of his new barn feeling like his life had just fundamentally changed in the space of less than a week. Tessa was the last to leave. She checked the barn one final time, tugging on beams to make sure they were secure, then turned to Dakota with satisfaction in her eyes. It is good work, you should be proud. I am, but I am also aware that I did not do it alone. No one does anything alone, Tessa said. That is the whole point. Now I will see you Sunday at church. You will see me before that if you let me, Dakota said. I could ride over to your place tomorrow, help with whatever work you need done. I owe your father at least a few days' labor. Come for dinner instead, Tessa said. Tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock. My father wants to get to know you better, and I want to see if you clean up as well as you work. Dakota laughed, some of the tension he had been carrying for days finally breaking apart. I will be there. She rode away as the last light faded from the sky, and Dakota went into his house and collapsed onto his bed, exhausted but happier than he had been in years. The barn was rebuilt. His supplies were salvaged. And somehow, in the middle of disaster, he had found something he had not even known he was looking for. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm that felt natural despite being entirely new. Dakota finished the work on his barn, adding shelves and organizing his salvaged supplies with a care he had not bothered with before. He started his spring planting, getting the seeds in the ground while the weather was still cooperative, and he found that the work felt different now, more purposeful somehow. He saw Tessa 3 times a week at minimum. Dinners at the Miller Ranch became a regular occurrence, And Samuel proved to be good company, a man who had strong opinions about everything from cattle breeding to national politics, but who also knew how to listen. Dakota helped out at the Miller Ranch whenever he could spare the time, working their spring roundup as promised and learning more about large-scale ranching than he had known before. But it was the time alone with Tessa that Dakota treasured most. They would ride out together on Sunday afternoons after church, exploring the country around Fort Worth, talking about everything and nothing. She told him about her dreams of expanding the ranch, of maybe breeding horses in addition to cattle. He told her about wanting to make his small holding successful enough that he could start a family without worrying about every dollar. "How many children do you want?" Tessa asked one Sunday in late April as they sat beside a creek watching the water run clear and fast with spring melt. "I had not thought about it specifically," Dakota admitted. "2, maybe 3. Enough to have company but not so many that we cannot feed them all. You, the same. Though I would want to make sure they understood that there is no shame in hard work, regardless of whether they are boys or girls. My mother taught me that, and it is maybe the most important lesson I ever learned." "You will be a good mother," Dakota said, and he meant it. He could picture her teaching children to ride, to work, to be strong and kind in equal measure. "And you will be a good father," Tessa said. She reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I can see it in how you treat animals, how you talk about the future. You are building something real, Dakota, something that will last." "I am trying," he said. "But I feel like I have been drifting for a long time, and it was only when the barn collapsed that I finally found a direction again." "Is that strange?" "Not strange at all. Sometimes it takes losing everything to figure out what really matters. And what really matters is people, Dakota. Connections, love. Everything else is just details." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the water, and Dakota felt a contentment he had not known was possible. He was falling in love with Tessa Miller, had maybe already fallen, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. By June, their courtship was common knowledge in Fort Worth, and Dakota was surprised to find that most people seemed pleased by the match. The women at church told him he was lucky to have caught Tessa's interest, and the men told him he had better treat her right if he knew what was good for him. He took both sentiments in stride, knowing they came from genuine affection for Tessa rather than any real concern about his character. There was only one person who seemed less than thrilled by the relationship, and that was Marcus Webb, the son of a wealthy rancher who had apparently been trying to court Tessa for the better part of 2 years without success. Dakota ran into him at the general store one Saturday afternoon, and the encounter was less than friendly. "So you are the one who finally caught her," Marcus said, looking Dakota up and down with barely concealed disdain. "I've got to say, I am surprised. I would have thought Tessa Miller would aim higher than a failed farmer with a collapsed barn." Dakota felt anger spike in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "I am not a failed farmer, and my barn is rebuilt. Only because the Millers took pity on you," Marcus sneered. "You are a charity case, Ashford, and once Tessa realizes that, she will come to her senses." "I think Tessa is perfectly capable of making her own decisions," Dakota said. "And I think she made it clear she was not interested in you, Webb. Maybe it is time you accepted that." Marcus's face darkened, and for a moment, Dakota thought the man might actually take a swing at him. But then the store owner cleared his throat loudly, and Marcus seemed to remember where they were. He stepped back, straightening his vest. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he said. "Because it will not last. Women like Tessa, they eventually realize they need a real man, not some dirt farmer playing at rancher." He walked out, and Dakota stood there trying to calm the fury thrumming through his veins. He knew Marcus was just being spiteful, knew that nothing the man said mattered in the face of what he and Tessa had together. But the words still stung, still poked at insecurities Dakota had been trying to ignore. He was still thinking about the encounter when he rode out to the Miller ranch that evening for dinner. Tessa took one look at his face and pulled him aside before they even got to the house. What happened? He told her about Marcus, about the things he had said, and by the time he finished, Tessa's expression had gone from concern to furious. "That man," she said, her voice tight with anger. "He has been making a nuisance of himself for 2 years, and he will not take no for an answer. I am going to have my father speak to his father, put an end to this nonsense. Tessa, I do not need you to fight my battles." "I am not fighting your battle, I am fighting mine," she said fiercely. "Marcus Webb seems to think I am some kind of prize to be won, and he cannot accept that I chose you instead of him. But you need to understand something, Dakota. I did not choose you because you were the best of a bad lot. I chose you because you are the only man I have ever met who sees me for who I really am and values that, instead of trying to change it. Marcus would have me married and pregnant and hidden away on his father's ranch within 6 months, turned into some kind of decoration instead of a partner. You would never do that." "No," Dakota said quietly. "I would never do that." "Then do not let his poison get into your head. We are building something real, you and I. Do not let anyone take that away from us." She kissed him then, right there in the yard where anyone could see, and Dakota felt the last of his doubt dissolve. Marcus Webb did not matter. Nothing mattered except this woman and this feeling and the future they were building together. Dinner that night was pleasant, with Samuel regaling them with stories about the early days of his ranch and the various disasters he had survived along the way. But as they were finishing dessert, he grew serious. "I want to talk to you about something," he said, looking at Dakota. "Both of you, actually." "What is it, Father?" Tessa asked. Samuel set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. "I am not getting any younger, and the ranch is getting harder to manage with just the 2 of us and the hands we can afford to hire. I have been thinking about expanding, taking on a partner who could help shoulder some of the responsibility." He looked directly at Dakota. "I know you have got your own place, and I respect that. But I also know that small holding is going to be hard to make profitable with just one man working it. So here is what I am proposing. You merge your land with mine, and we run it as one operation. You would own a share of the whole thing, not just your original plot. And when I am gone, it would all go to you and Tessa together." Dakota felt his breath catch. "Samuel, that is incredibly generous, but I cannot just take half your ranch. You would not be taking it, you would be earning it, and it would not be half, it would be a third. I still plan on living long enough to be a pain in both your necks for years to come." Samuel smiled, but his eyes were serious. "Look, I know you and my daughter are heading toward marriage. Anyone with eyes can see it. And when that happens, I want to know that you both have a solid foundation to build on. This ranch can support a family, support multiple families eventually. Your little place, no offense intended, probably cannot. Not easily anyway." Dakota looked at Tessa, who was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "What do you think?" "I think my father is right," she said. "I think we could build something amazing together, all 3 of us, but I also think it has to be your choice, Dakota. I do not want you to feel pressured into anything." Dakota thought about his small holding, the land he had bought with his parents' insurance money, the place he had been trying to turn into home for 3 years. He had poured everything into it, had nearly broken himself trying to make it work. But the truth was, it was a struggle, and it would likely always be a struggle. What Samuel was offering was not charity. It was partnership, the chance to be part of something bigger, something that could actually thrive instead of just survive. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Samuel said. "Take all the time you need, but know that the offer is genuine and it stands regardless of what you decide." Dakota rode home that night with his head spinning. The offer was amazing, but it also meant giving up the independence he had been so determined to achieve. It meant admitting that he could not make it alone, that he needed help. But maybe that was not such a terrible thing. Maybe the whole point of what he had learned over the past few months was that nobody made it alone, that community and partnership were not signs of weakness, but signs of strength. He made his decision 3 days later, and he told Tessa first, riding out to find her as she was working with a young horse in the corral behind the Miller ranch house. "I want to accept your father's offer," he said without preamble, "but I have a condition." Tessa stopped what she was doing and came to lean on the corral fence beside him. "What condition?" "I want us to be married before we finalize the partnership. I do not want your father to think I am marrying you for the ranch, and I do not want anyone in Fort Worth to think it either. So we do this in the right order. I court you properly for another few months, I propose properly, we get married, and then we talk about business. Does that work for you?" Tessa was quiet for a long moment, and Dakota felt his heart start to pound with nervousness. Then she smiled, slow and sure. "That works for me, though I hope you realize you just basically proposed to me in a roundabout way." "I suppose I did," Dakota said. "Was it too roundabout? Should I try again?" "No," Tessa said, reaching for his hand. "It was perfect. You are perfect. And yes, when you ask me properly in a few months, I will say yes. But let us do this your way. Let us make sure everyone knows this is about love, not land." They told Samuel that evening, and he seemed pleased by Dakota's insistence on doing things in the proper order. "You are a good man, Dakota Ashford. I am glad my daughter found you." The summer passed in a blur of hard work and stolen moments of happiness. Dakota split his time between his own land and the Miller Ranch, learning the ins and outs of their operation while still maintaining his own place. He and Tessa were together as often as propriety allowed, and Dakota found himself constantly amazed by her competence and her kindness, and the way she could make him laugh even when he was exhausted from a long day's work. In September, as the weather began to cool and the leaves started to turn, Dakota finally asked Tessa to marry him. He did it properly, taking her out to the spot by the creek where they had spent so many Sunday afternoons, getting down on one knee with a ring he had bought in Fort Worth with money he had saved carefully over the summer. "Tessa Miller," he said, his voice shaking slightly with nerves and emotion, "you saved my life when my barn collapsed, and you have been saving it every day since. You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him hard enough to make his head spin. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in October, in a simple ceremony at the church in Fort Worth with half the county in attendance. Tessa wore a simple white dress that her mother had worn at her own wedding, and Dakota wore a new suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable, but was worth it for the look on Tessa's face when she saw him. Samuel walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up shook the rafters. The wedding reception was held at the Miller Ranch, with food and music and dancing that lasted until well past dark. Dakota danced with his new wife until his feet hurt, and he did not care about anything except the feel of her in his arms and the knowledge that this was forever, that he had found his home not in a place but in a person. They spent their wedding night in the house Dakota had built on his original property, which would soon become part of the larger ranch operation. Tessa had insisted on it, saying she wanted their first night as husband and wife to be in the place where Dakota had experienced his greatest crisis and his greatest victory. "This is where we began," she said as they lay together in the darkness, her head on his chest, his arms around her. "That morning when the barn collapsed and I rode over to help, this is where our story started, and I wanted to honor that. Our story is not finished yet," Dakota said, kissing the top of her head. "We are just getting started." "I know," Tessa said, "and I cannot wait to see where it goes." The next few years proved her right in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated. They merged Dakota's land with the Miller Ranch, creating an operation that was large enough to be truly profitable. Samuel taught Dakota everything he knew about ranching, and Dakota proved to be an apt student, bringing his own innovations to the operation. Tessa continued to work alongside them, and together the three of them built something that became known throughout the region as one of the best-run ranches in Texas. In the spring of 1884, Tessa gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Daniel. He was healthy and loud, with Dakota's dark hair and Tessa's green eyes, and from the moment Dakota held him, he understood love in a way he never had before. Tessa was an amazing mother, somehow managing to care for an infant while still helping run the ranch, and Dakota made sure to do his share of the work, getting up for nighttime feedings and changing diapers without complaint. Samuel was besotted with his grandson, and watching the older man teach Daniel to ride before the boy could even walk properly was one of Dakota's greatest joys. The ranch house, which had felt too big and empty when it was just Samuel and Tessa, suddenly felt full and alive with a child in it. In 1886, they had a daughter, Rose, who came into the world with the same fierce determination her mother possessed. She was barely walking before she was trying to follow Daniel out to the barns, and Tessa joked that they were going to have their hands full with her. Dakota did not mind. He loved watching his children grow, loved teaching them about the land and the animals, loved seeing parts of himself and Tessa reflected in their faces and personalities. Samuel passed away in the winter of 1888, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 62. It was a devastating loss, but Dakota and Tessa took comfort in the fact that he had lived to see his grandchildren, that he had died knowing the ranch he had built was in good hands. They buried him on a hill overlooking the property with a simple marker that read, "Samuel Miller. Good father, good rancher, good man." After Samuel's death, Dakota and Tessa officially became co-owners of the entire operation, which they ran together with an efficiency that impressed everyone who knew them. They were partners in the truest sense, making decisions together, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating victories as a team. The ranch prospered. They expanded their cattle herd, started breeding horses as Tessa had always wanted, and even diversified into crops on some of the better land. They hired more workers, built a proper bunkhouse, and became one of the largest employers in the region. But through it all, they never forgot where they had started, never forgot the morning when disaster had brought them together. Marcus Webb tried to cause trouble a few more times over the years, spreading rumors about Dakota and making veiled threats about challenging their land claims. But he found no support in Fort Worth, where Dakota and Tessa were well liked and respected. Eventually, Marcus's father tired of his son's behavior and sent him to manage a property in New Mexico, and they never heard from him again. In 1890, Tessa gave birth to twins, another boy and girl they named Samuel and Grace after both their fathers and the quality they felt had carried them through the hardest times. The twins were a handful, but Daniel and Rose stepped up to help, and Dakota found that his heart, which he had thought could not possibly hold any more love, somehow expanded to make room. The barn that the neighbors had helped Dakota build that day in 1882 stood strong for years, a testament to good construction and community effort. But in 1892, Dakota decided it was time to expand. The ranch had grown too large for the original barn to serve their needs, and so he designed a new structure, bigger and better, using everything he had learned over the years. This time, he hired professional builders, but he still did much of the work himself, with Tessa working alongside him whenever she could spare the time from the children. They built it on a proper stone foundation that would never rot, with heavy beams that could withstand the worst weather Texas could throw at them. And when it was finished, they held a celebration, inviting all the neighbors who had helped them 10 years earlier, thanking them again for the kindness that had changed Dakota's life. "It is funny," Dakota said to Tessa as they stood in the doorway of the new barn, watching their children play in the hayloft above. "If that first barn had never collapsed, I might never have met you. I might have just kept struggling along alone, never knowing what I was missing." "Fate works in mysterious ways," Tessa said, leaning against him. "But I like to think we would have found each other eventually. Some things are just meant to be." "You believe that we were meant to be?" "I believe that love is a choice as much as it is a feeling," Tessa said. "And I believe we chose each other every single day through every hard moment and every happy one. That is what makes it real." Dakota pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I choose you, Tessa Ashford, today and every day for the rest of my life. And I choose you," she said, "always." The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated births and mourned deaths, saw their children grow and begin to show signs of the people they would become. Daniel developed his father's quiet determination and his mother's love of horses, and by the time he was 15, he was already talking about taking over the ranch one day. Rose had her mother's fierce independence and her father's gentle heart, and she announced at 13 that she was going to be the best horsewoman in Texas, a goal nobody doubted she would achieve. The twins, Samuel and Grace, were inseparable and completely different. Samuel was scholarly, always reading, always asking questions about how things worked, while Grace was adventurous, constantly getting into scrapes that gave her parents gray hairs. But they loved their siblings fiercely, and Dakota and Tessa both knew they would always look out for each other. In 1898, when Dakota was 42 and Tessa was 39, they sat on the porch of their ranch house one evening watching the sun set over the land they had built together. Their children were scattered across the property, doing evening chores, and the sound of their voices and laughter drifted on the warm air. "You ever think about that morning when it all started?" Tessa asked. "When the barn collapsed?" "All the time," Dakota admitted. "I think about how lost I felt, how certain I was that I had failed at everything I had tried to build. And then I think about how you came riding over that hill and everything changed." "I was so scared that morning," Tessa said softly, "not of the work but of what I was feeling. I saw you standing there and I knew even then that you were going to be important to me. It was terrifying. But you stayed." "But I stayed," she agreed, "because the best things in life are worth being scared for, and you were worth it, Dakota. You are worth it. This life we have built, this family, this love, it is worth everything." Dakota reached over and took her hand, feeling the calluses that marked a lifetime of hard work, the strength that had never wavered. "I love you, Tessa. More now than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is the greatest gift you could ever give me," she said. "Not the ranch, not the security, not any of the material things, just that love growing deeper with every year, That is what I treasure most." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, and Dakota felt a contentment so complete it was almost painful. His life had not turned out anything like he had planned when he first came to Texas as a young man looking for a fresh start. It had been harder, more complicated, full of unexpected twists and turns. But it had also been infinitely better than anything he could have imagined. The barn collapse that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning. It had brought Tessa into his life, had taught him the value of community and partnership, had shown him that strength was not about doing everything alone, but about knowing when to accept help and when to offer it. Everything good in his life could be traced back to that moment of disaster, to the morning when everything fell apart and then, piece by piece, was rebuilt into something better. In 1902, Daniel married a girl from a neighboring ranch, a smart young woman named Elizabeth who could rope as well as any man, and who Daniel looked at the way Dakota looked at Tessa. They held the wedding on the ranch, and Dakota walked his son through the same barns and pastures he had walked 1,000 times, passing on the legacy of hard work and love that Samuel Miller had started, and that he and Tessa had continued. Rose left for college in Austin in 1903, determined to learn about veterinary medicine so she could come back and care for the ranch's animals more effectively. Tessa cried when they put her on the train, but she was proud too, proud that their daughter had dreams and the courage to chase them. The twins were still young, still figuring out who they wanted to be, but Dakota and Tessa gave them the same thing they had given all their children: unconditional love, firm guidance, and the freedom to make their own choices. In 1905, Daniel and Elizabeth had a son, making Dakota and Tessa grandparents for the first time. They named him Dakota Samuel, and when Dakota held his grandson for the first time, he felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that brought tears to his eyes. This child would grow up on the ranch, would learn the same lessons Dakota had learned, would hopefully find the same kind of love Dakota had found with Tessa. The years moved faster now, each season blending into the next with a kind of beautiful inevitability. Dakota and Tessa began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, letting Daniel take on more responsibility while they enjoyed their role as grandparents and advisors. They traveled some, taking a trip to St. Louis and another to Denver, but they always came back to the ranch, to the land that had become more than just property but a living testament to everything they had built together. In 1910, on their 30th wedding anniversary, Dakota took Tessa back to the spot by the creek where he had proposed. It looked much the same as it had all those years ago, though they were older now, their hair gray and their faces lined with the marks of time and weather. 30 years, Tessa said, sitting beside him on the same rock where they had sat so many times before. It has gone so fast. And yet it feels like I have known you forever, Dakota said. Like there was never a time when you were not part of my life. Do you have any regrets? Dakota thought about it seriously, wanting to give her an honest answer. No, not a single one. Every choice I made led me here to you, to this life. How could I regret any of it? I feel the same way, Tessa said. She leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat watching the water flow by, listening to the wind in the cottonwood trees. We have been so lucky, you and I. It was not all luck, a lot of it was hard work. True. But luck played its part, the luck that I heard your barn collapse that morning. The luck that I decided to ride over instead of waiting to see if you needed help. The luck that we were both ready for love when we found each other. Maybe it was not luck at all, Dakota said. Maybe it was meant to be, like you said all those years ago. Maybe, Tessa agreed. Though I still think we made our own destiny, one choice at a time. They celebrated their anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch, a massive party that drew people from all over the county. Dakota gave a speech, thanking everyone who had helped them over the years, thanking Tessa for being his partner and his love, thanking his children for being the best thing he and Tessa had ever created together. "Life is not about avoiding disaster," he said, standing on the porch with his family gathered around. "It is about how you respond when disaster strikes. 30 years ago, my barn collapsed. I thought I was ruined. But a woman I barely knew came riding over to help me, and she did not just help me rebuild the barn. She helped me rebuild my entire life. She taught me about partnership, about love, about what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. Everything I am, everything we have built here, started with that act of kindness." He looked at Tessa, who was watching him with tears in her eyes. "So my advice to all of you, to my children and my grandchildren and everyone who has gathered here today, is this. Be the person who rides over when they hear the crash. Be the person who offers help without being asked. Be the person who sees someone struggling and decides to do something about it. Because you never know when that simple act of kindness might change everything." The applause was thunderous, and Dakota sat back down beside Tessa, taking her hand. "Did I do okay?" "You did perfectly," she said, kissing his cheek. "You always do." They lived another 20 years together. Years full of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Years of watching the ranch continue to prosper under Daniel's capable management. Years of sitting on their porch in the evenings and talking about everything and nothing. They were never apart for more than a few hours at a time, and the love between them never dimmed but only grew deeper and more comfortable with each passing year. Dakota died in 1930 at the age of 74, peacefully in his sleep with Tessa beside him. His last words to her were, "I love you," the same words he had said to her thousands of times over their 48 years of marriage, and Tessa held his hand until the end, whispering back, "I love you too." Tessa followed him 6 months later at the age of 71. Daniel found her in the morning, sitting in her chair on the porch with a blanket over her lap and a smile on her face, gone as peacefully as his father had. They buried her beside Dakota on the hill next to Samuel Miller, with a marker that read, "Tessa Miller Ashford, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and partner." At the funeral, Daniel told the story of how his parents had met, about the barn collapse and his mother's decision to help a stranger, about how that single act of kindness had grown into a love story that had lasted nearly half a century, and had created a legacy that would endure for generations. "They taught us," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that love is not just a feeling but a choice, and that we choose it every day through our actions. They taught us that community matters, that we are stronger together than alone. And they taught us that even in our darkest moments, when everything seems lost, there is always hope if we are willing to work for it and accept help when it is offered." The ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's management, and eventually under the management of his children and grandchildren. The barn that Dakota had rebuilt after the collapse stood for another 70 years before finally being replaced, but even then, they salvaged some of the original beams and incorporated them into the new structure, a way of honoring the past while building toward the future. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting over the Texas prairie, you could sometimes see people sitting on the porch of the old ranch house, holding hands and talking softly, continuing the tradition that Dakota and Tessa had started all those years ago. Because that was their true legacy, not the land or the buildings or the cattle, but the love they had shared and the example they had set for everyone who came after them. It had all started with a disaster, with a barn collapsing in the pre-dawn darkness and a young man standing in the ruins of everything he had worked for. But it had ended with something beautiful, something that transcended the original tragedy and turned it into the foundation of a life well lived. That was the power of choosing to help, of choosing to love, of choosing to build again even when everything fell apart. And that was the story of Dakota Ashford and Tessa Miller, two people who found each other in the midst of disaster and built a love that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the beginning of something wonderful, if only we are brave enough to let them be.